Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Purposeful Wisdom Podcast. It is yours truly, Dawn Christine. Thank you guys so much for being here. It's such an honor to share the wisdom and knowledge with my audience. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share. You guys know this platform is all about healing emotionally, mentally, physically. I bring you guys the best of the best on this platform, and today is no different. I have with me Edie Nathan today. She's an author, public speaker, licensed therapist, and foremost authority on grief and trauma. She is an AASECT certified sex therapist, hypnotherapist, and certified EMDR practitioner with more than 20 years of experience. Edie earned degrees from New York University and Fordham University with a postgraduate training at the Ackerman Institute for Family Therapy. She currently practices in New York City. Welcome in, Edie. Thank you so much for being here today.
Dawn, it's a pleasure to be with you today.
Oh my gosh. So, I always love to start out with what inspired you? What inspired you to pursue a career in counseling and trauma recovery?
So it actually didn't begin with trauma. It began with grief.
Okay.
And when I was 27, I lost my love, and we had been together for a very short period of time, 2 years. And I was 27, he was much older than me. And I realized that as much as I was trying to find help for me to navigate through the tenuous strings of grief, that the messaging that I was getting from the people who loved me and from clinicians is, you're young, don't worry about it, you're going to find another person and just go on with your life, which was a messaging that didn't agree with me, one, but also sent me into a tizzy of what's wrong with me. Maybe I'm holding on to this too long, and how long is too long? And there began my journey. I'd always been interested in grief, but I was going to use grief and use it in the workplace. And instead, I stopped what I was going to be doing. And I said, okay, I need to think about this grief in a different way. And I want to make it accessible for all people. And that was really where the journey began. But when you get into the tentacles of grief and the quicksand where it takes your mentality, your mental stabilization, and then I got a couple masters and realized I'm just not working with grief. People are coming in with issues around losses that aren't just about the loss of loved ones. They're coming in with losses that may not be considered losses. And there's a name for this, which is disenfranchised grief. Not my term, but a term that legitimizes the grief that is experienced, in corners and and hiding in places that we don't normally look. When then the traumatic stories began to come in, so did the stories of sexual abuse. So did the stories of losses of the sense of self, of personal identity, and a loss of loving the self, a loss of feeling, I don't even know where I belong. And now let's fast forward. I wrote a book on grief called It's Grief, and then realized, we are grieving so many things and they're not being addressed. And then the pandemic hits, right? I want to talk about grief and how it just manifested in our young people, in our older people, in families who had loved ones in long-term care and they couldn't access them, or for families who were dealing with teenagers who were about to graduate and could no longer attend a prom or plan a prom, or maybe even have a first kiss. And so all of these pandemic related issues around grief, around trauma, and around one's sexual identity, sexual orientation, and what I have now coined sexual grief is everywhere. And so I see that we are in a pandemic, not only of reactivity to the pandemic, but reactivity to a pandemic of trauma and of trying to figure out where we belong.
That makes a lot of sense to me because oftentimes everyone tells you to just brush it off, get over it, get on with your life, you're resilient. And it's not a question of if you're resilient or not, it's how do I cope?
That's right.
Often when it's not treated in a healthy way, that's when you spiral, that's when you go out of control and you even lose more of yourself, because then people that feel that they're in a loss, they often turn to things like drugs, alcohol, sex addiction, porn addiction. I mean, it spans out, forget it. How do you feel about that in general, like that people oftentimes put pressure on other people to just brush it off and put on a face, so to speak? What are your thoughts on that?
So have you ever worn a mask, not a literal mask, but the mask that you walk with that may look like I'm okay, even if you're just crying inside?
Up until 4.5 years ago, yes, I can honestly say most of my life I had to put on a mask to people please others, for sure.
Yeah. And so we have many different masks that we wear. And those masks can keep us, sane and separate and distant while there's intrinsic pain that we're walking with and hiding. The you mentioned sex addiction. There's another framework that is gaining more and more popularity in the world of sex therapy, which is calling, instead of referring to sex addiction as sex addiction, that it is out of control sexual behavior. And it is based in anxiety. And so any of the coping mechanisms that take us down into an emotional labyrinth that feels like like quicksand, is a way of trying to deal with and cope with anxiety, right?
Right. Absolutely.
And so it's about being able to find safe people, being able to find safe coping mechanisms. And that safety can be sometimes in a release like exercise, or having a friend that you can talk to, and I know, sometimes we talk about journal writing, but actually taking what's going on in the mind and writing it down can take what's inside and move it out. And
Yes.
so that's what the goal is to shake things up. And I call these cognitive interrupters. We need to go in and say, stop it, brain. Let's shift. Let's change the way we're thinking or we're doing this. Let's go wash our hands under like cold water or
Yeah.
reach out to a friend.
Absolutely, I agree with that. And I heard because it interrupts the brain receptors, especially cold water. A lot of people don't know that if you're even having an anxiety attack or you feel stressed out, splashing cold water, they say it's an old wives' trick, but it's so true. It interrupts that brain cognition to where all your hormones calm down in the brain. So it makes perfect sense to me.
And that's exactly it, Dawn. That's what you want to do. You want to find a way, and it's not going to be the same way for everybody. And you might have been using the cold water remedy, and then that stops working. For whatever reason, it stops working. And so what we want to do is have a lot of different tools that we can access. So the cold water is one, of snapping a rubber band is another. These are behavior modification techniques. Okay, let's snap the rubber band, let's say stop it, and then let's change the thought. Grief loves to come in and in a variety of different ways. And it doesn't look the same from day to day, sometimes from minute to minute. To understand that is then say, okay, sometimes I'm so overwhelmed with the emotions that have to do with my grief, loss of self, loss of a loved one, or loss of something that's been dear to you, that may not be dear to anybody else, and so they don't understand where you're coming from, right? And to be able to say, okay, I might have lost that for this moment in time, but let me at least remember it with a certain amount of honor or respect or grace. And if there's a moment in time when you're overwhelmed and you can't really deal with it in that moment, I love to suggest to people, and I talk about this in my book, It's Grief. Let's imagine that you've got a cry box or a box that is your dumping ground, and you go back to it later in the day and you deal with the things you didn't have time to deal with during the course of a day.
I like that. And especially that you have a designated area in that box, so to speak. And, people don't realize too that, there is 5 stages of grief and they don't necessarily go in order either. I remember several things that, I experienced grief with. Sometimes it was, sadness and anger, and it was, kind of like in that respective order. And then other times it would be completely opposite for me, because grief is really different for everybody, and it's their truth. So what looks like grief for one person may not look like you said, for another person. But I think there has to be a level of respect across the board, that even though you may not understand how I'm grieving, respect it. And not I think the worst thing someone can say is, "Oh, you'll be better," or you'll be fine. You're going to be fine. Chin up." Because it's also not validating the grief that someone is experiencing. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's so important to validate someone else's grief, but we often cannot understand what they're going through. And sometimes that's exactly what needs to be said. I don't know what you're going through, and I want to be here with you.
Agreed. Just that simple validation, not necessarily understanding it, but just
Correct.
saying, "You know what? I understand, I may not resonate with you, but I know you're going through something and I respect that." And just be that level of comfort for someone instead of being dismissive, because I think realistically that adds
It
to the
can.
trauma.
It absolutely can. It can add to the experience of the grief or to the traumatic experiencing. And if for your audience, if you can just be curious, and if you can think that the person you are talking to, when you care about them and they look stuck to you and they're not moving in the way that you want them to, they're kind of in a hostage situation. And that hostage situation is one where they are stuck and they don't want to be stuck and they don't know how to get out. Curiosity is a wonderful beginning to helping them understand that if they can be curious about what they're experiencing, and you as a friend or family member can be curious, you're not going in with any kind of judgment.
Exactly. And I think that's what most people need in order to properly heal, is that they feel supported, that there is a support system around them, even though they may not understand exactly what the other person is going through. I think that's crucial.
Absolutely.
I know that your background at the Ackerman Institute is very significant in how you practice. How did that influence your therapeutic approach, especially when it came to grief and trauma?
So the Ackerman Institute was just the beginning of my work in the family system. And their training was rigorous, to the point where you were behind like a double mirror, and you were sitting in a room interviewing and working with a couple or a family. And if you didn't do it right, you got a phone call, and you had to pick up the phone and say yes. And then Ilana, who was my supervisor, would say, "Don't go in that direction, go in another direction." What that enabled me to do is actually have a voice in my head that, and I don't have voices. I mean, unless the normal ones, okay.
I know.
I mean, we all have our normal voices and we need our normal voices. And I just want to say that, okay. But it's almost like being in session and also having another perspective that's going on in the background. Okay. And so that has really helped me to formulate how I look at just everything, that there's always another lens. There is always another lens, which you mentioned the 5 stages, and I want to go back to that just for a minute.
Absolutely.
Because the 5 stages were amazingly written and curated and studied by Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. When she wrote that, it was for the dying. It was really not for the living. And I so honor her work. And then her work got expanded. And now they talk about the 6 stages of grief. However, I've kind of taken a little bit of a turn, a different turn. And it's that other perspective that becomes a yes and. And the yes and perspective is that I actually see that there are 11 phases because we move in and out. And so when she talked about anger, there is anger, but along with the anger, I think that there's rage. And I think that anger and anxiety are very, very tied together. And what I've learned is that if someone is anxious, they don't have expressed anger. And if you can get them to express their anger, the anxiety kind of quiets. And so when someone is traumatized and they're in their anger or they're in their anxiety, I'm going to help them focus on anger. And anger is something that many people don't even want to touch. My 11 phases go in and out of one another, just like you expressed. Like there's no order. There is no order. There's no definitive, oh, and I wish there were. I wish it was like, okay, so first you're going to experience this, and then this, and then this, and then this. And it's nicely, neatly wrapped up.
Right.
There's nothing neat about it.
No.
It's as messy as it comes. And so traumatic experiencing is messy. The healing part of it, I'm not going to lie to you. Healing doesn't mean it just goes away.
No.
We want to believe I'm healed now. It's gone. Like it's kind of like, oh, I got a paper cut and it's annoying and it hurts, but then it goes away and I forget about it. I'm not going to ask anyone, Dawn, to forget. I am going to invite them to remember peacefully.
Yes. I couldn't agree more, because healing is an ongoing process, especially when you go through trauma or any kind of loss or sadness. I think for the most part, remembering the good also helps keep someone grounded. At least I know for me it did. Forgiveness is huge. I think
Forgiveness is
huge part of it.
And that is one of my phases. And forgiving doesn't mean forgetting.
Right.
So I'm curious, why do you think forgiveness is so important?
Because it's not for the other person, it's for you. Because it's, I've been estranged from my family for almost 5 years now. And I grew up in a very toxic family environment. And, I was on and off with them for most of my life until one day I said, enough's enough. Like, I cannot do this anymore. And as hard as it was, and I went through all the grieving, all the stages. And like you said, in and out, happy, sad, I was all over the place. I had compassion for me. But then when I looked back at how my parents were raised, that gave me compassion for them and empathy for them and forgiveness for them, because I understood how they were raised the same way in an unhealthy environment. So it was generational trauma looking back, and I had to do what I had to do, but there is love from a distance. Like, I want my family to heal because they deserve to heal too. So having that empathy and that sympathy and understanding the why behind it and separating the act from the person really helped me forgive and just be with it and accept it.
Hmm. Yes. Yes. Yeah. There's a Dr. Enright who writes a lot about forgiveness. And for anyone who's interested in his work, you just have to Google his name. He's really quite an amazing writer on forgiveness. And I quote him in my first book on grief. So the way that you just laid it out is exactly right. You said it so beautifully. It's
Thank you.
quotable.
Oh, thank
Yeah.
you. Maybe I will quote it. Who knows?
Good.
No, you know, when people come to you and they're going through whatever type of trauma and grief, because I really feel they go hand in hand. I really, really do. You know, how do you start the journey with someone? Like someone is willing to come to you and say, listen, this is what I have going on. Where do you even begin with your clients to validate their experience and then teach them the appropriate coping skills that they'll take into the rest of their life? Because, like you said, it's not like you will never forget. You will move past it through time and healthy coping mechanisms. But what would be the first step to lay that foundation for them where they can now move forward in a healthy manner?
So, the work is going to be different with everyone because everyone who comes in is different, right? I always want to know the timeline of their lives and where there were fractures or where there were losses, and not just losses of loved ones, losses in their lives or developmental periods that were really hard for them. And we can tell our stories. Our stories, though, when we've told them over and over and over again, have less meaning to the storyteller.
Yeah.
So before they trust me with their stories that they told over and over and over again, I want to hear what gives them joy or what used to give them joy. I'm not going to just go into the depth of the work because they should trust me and they want to trust me. But the reality is that we don't come in to therapy thinking, I can trust this person. And even if we want to believe it or fool ourselves, okay, like I'm paying this person, I'm going to trust them. That trust needs to be earned. So instead of going it right into, okay, let's go into the nitty-gritty of this work, I'm going to perhaps teach some exercises so that you can learn to regulate yourself when the work starts to get intense and you're feeling like your brains are like spaghetti.
Yeah. No, that's so true because I often feel, you know, that during healing, a lot of triggers come up too. And it's learning how to cope with those triggers. But we often focus so much on the negative, the trauma, that we forget that that there are things in our lives that bring us joy. And, you
Or
know,
that may
having that
have brought us joy. That's right.
right. And having that balance, I think, is crucial because if we go down that hole, if we go down that rabbit hole, so to speak, and we only focus on the bad or the traumatic or the grief, then we're dismissing all the good things that are in our lives. And for me, it was being optimistic and open minded every single day. And even if my entire day felt like everything was going wrong, I would sit there and be with self and try to pinpoint at least one positive thing, even if it was waking up, that I can hold on to not be stuck in that grief pattern. And that seemed to work for me, holding on to the good of what brings me joy in my life.
Mm-hmm. And so that worked for you and it might work for others. It's being able to learn from the client. Okay, you were able to get yourself to this appointment. And so right there, there's something really dynamic about you. You got here. How did you get here? How did you make that first appointment? How did you, because that's resilience right
Yep.
there.
Yep.
And so it is like just taking the tiny steps, the small steps, because when someone is feeling that kind of trauma and has had traumatic experiencing, and it's all mixed in with grief and loss and the deathing of the self, often that there is often accompanying that a sense of self-loathing, a sense of I'm not worth loving.
Right.
And they need to be liberated from that. And so the work is really about liberation. That's really what it's about.
Yes. And I couldn't agree more. Like I felt, and still feel like I was reborn, like I had a soul death, so to speak. And, I empowered myself. I feel liberated now. And I won't sugarcoat it. And I don't on this channel by any means. I let my viewers know raw and real that healing is an ongoing process. It is a forever process. And you're going to have your good days and your bad days. Showing yourself the compassion and love for self is so important, and giving yourself that space to just be with the feeling, be with the moment, recognize it, is key for me. I know for others it is too. And shifting, that mindset, so to speak, of, okay, I recognize it, I see it for what it is, but I don't have to stay there. I can just kind of let that go, because it is, that's our fight, flight, freeze mechanism too, thinking that we're in danger. That's our body's job. And I've realized that, is to protect. But I felt for me, it was recognizing it and then knowing, okay, I see you, but I got this. So giving it, like putting it in that box, so to speak, that you were talking about before.
Yeah.
And I'd love to know, especially that you specialize in EMDR, which is like eye movement desensitization. And I've experienced that myself, and it worked wonders towards my trauma healing. Could you explain to my audience what that is and how that plays such an important role in trauma healing?
So it is a tool. It is a technique. It is not a therapy unto itself. It's real important for your listeners to understand that someone who practices EMDR is a clinician. They've been trained, and this is a tool that they use. It is not solely a therapy.
Right.
Okay, it's not like, oh, I'm going to a Freudian therapist or I'm going to a Gestalt therapist. Someone who does EMDR is using that as a helper to navigate the way that the brain holds on to the trauma. So when people have a traumatic experience or event, they have the natural responses. Those natural responses can be self-loathing. A natural response can be, I'm not worth loving. A natural response can be, I can't find a job, I feel stuck. Or in the worst case scenarios, I can't get the memory of the bombing out of my head. EMDR was used for the survivors of Columbine, for any of your listeners who know of Columbine. Yeah. For the survivors of 9/11, if any of your listeners know of 9/11. And I imagine for what is going on in the Middle East, that those survivors will also, there's an organization called EMDRIA, and they are an international organization, and they go and work with people who have survived wars and are military, and people who have been part of bombings like Columbine or shootings like what just happened in Maine. And so what happens when there is a trauma is that the brain immediately goes into the flight, fight, fawn freeze mechanism. And it's at times what happens is the brain captures the essence and the emotion of that experience, and it does a flash freeze in the body, in the brain, in the mind, in the soul, in one spiritual being, to a point where it is then difficult to navigate life in such a way that you're free from that state of frozen memory. What EMDR does is, and different clinicians will do it differently, but it is accessing, and they know this from brain scans. So I want your listening audience to know is that they've been able to see EMDR in action as they're looking at like an MRI machine, that it actually goes into the left and the right brains, and it actually changes the way someone holds on to the trauma and where in the brain the trauma is held, by changing the way that the memory is seen, so that the memory initially is not only like face forward in your face, it's like located in the body. It's like the body is frozen with it, right? So what EMDR does is I call it like the artichoke effect. You peel the leaves off, and EMDR takes one leaf of that experience, one memory, and peels it away and looks at it and asks you what you think as you look at it, how you feel, to gauge it on a scale of 1 to 10. And there's a very specific languaging that Francine Shapiro, its originator, she's brilliant, created for this EMDR tool. And basically, it is done either through a tapping that happens, or a watching of a finger, or a dot across a machine that has a dot that goes left and right. And you are asked to think about that picture and think about any of the emotions or the physical feelings you had during that picture. And then every, let's say, minute or so, depending on the pace and depending on what the clinician sees, they then say, and there's no conversation during the time that the dot is moving from left to right, or the tapping is being tapped left and right, that then there is a stopping. What did you notice? There is feedback, and there is no interpretation of what the feedback is. The feedback is given, and then the picture, or whatever the new picture is, gets to be revisited. When this is done over and over and over again, and sometimes EMDR sessions are not your 45-minute session. They are often, 90 minutes at least, because there's the prep, the warm up, the actual activity of the EMDR, and then there's the kind of the closure of the EMDR session. What will often happen is the way that the picture is initially held, the way that the traumatic picture, the memory of that war zone, or the way your body felt during that time, there's a distance. It's not that you forget. There's no brainwashing going on. What is happening is you're creating a valuable distance between what's going on in the memory and the brain and what actually happened, so that there's less ownership of what happened within the mind and the body, and your life is no longer in a phase of being frozen.
That was a beautiful explanation. And that's definitely something very similar to what I experienced, and it makes me question, because you said that different practitioners do it different ways. I remember when I had my sessions, my practitioner literally told me to bring someone into that scenario, so to speak, and rewrite the ending. Like almost like where I had a support buddy there in the moment with me. And this practitioner said it could be anyone. You could bring in Wonder Woman if you want, but
That's right.
changing the narrative of the ending of that clip, right? So I was told to, go through the motions and then picture literally like a color and like wipe the slate clean and now redo the entire thing and alter, almost, I'll use that word, my perception of the ending of that clip, and to make it where now I'm not holding it on into my body. And I'll be honest with you, I question that. I like when my practitioner tells me this, I looked at him and I went, but then that's not what happened. That's not like what, so what is the point of this if it's like, am I lying to myself to change what I know to be true? How does that even work? And I remember what he said at the time. I don't remember specifically because it was so long ago, but all I know is it worked. It
Yeah.
worked for me. Do you find this common in other styles where
Since I'm not
certain
in the room, since I'm not in the room with other clinicians, I can't really tell you about how they use the formula. What I can say though is that there is a place where there is at the very beginning of any EMDR session, this is the story, this is the picture. And the question that I ask, so, and these are the feelings: I am out of control, I hate myself, I am no good. And then the next, after gathering all of that information, the next question is, when you think of that picture, how would you rather be feeling? And so the picture doesn't change in the way that I do it. What changes is how you feel about it when you look
right,
at it.
right,
And so I am in control. I am safe. And so, well, if you are safe, where would you feel that safety in your body? In my gut, in my heart. Okay. So then after, and this is a process, you don't jump there. So,
right.
but I will focus on how would you rather be feeling? How, when you look at that picture, you know, what would you like to think of yourself? I am brave. I don't have to be affected by this. I am alive, even though I felt like I might be dead.
Right.
So to bring in helper agents, why not?
Right.
I think we all need helper agents. And I love to think of we all need our superpowers. Why are so many movies out there, the superpower movies, that are fun and a little ridiculous and we know aren't really based in reality? I mean, it would really be nice to be able to say, I'm going to fly, but
Right.
but it's not going to happen. But it doesn't mean that we can't think of our superpowers and who we might want to help join us. I will say, though, that we do have a superpower that sometimes we do not use enough, and that's the brain.
I agree. I agree. I think thoughts become things, and what we tell ourselves each and every day and how we respond to things each and every day will either send us into a negative state of mind or a positive state of mind. And this is all, from me learning throughout the years of my own grief and my own trauma, and that's what led me to do the field I'm in now, because I think belief systems are so important of how we show up for ourselves and what we say to ourselves and our mindset, I agree that not everything is going to be hunky dory. It's not butterflies and rainbows. It's work, and it takes dedication and commitment. But I often have to tell even my own clients, like, aren't you worth it? Aren't you worth healing and getting to a place where you are good with you and you feel joy and you feel love and you love yourself and you love the things you do? Don't you deserve that? because I think we all do. And we've all been through so much the last few years, especially with COVID and now everything going on overseas. It breaks your heart to know that there's people out there suffering, and this world needs to unite, and we need to heal as a whole. I think this entire world needs to come together and heal as a whole, because there's so much negativity out there. There's so much loss and grief and pain. And instead of having us be diverse and divide this world, I would love to see this world come together in unity and in healing, because I think that's what we need more than anything.
And it is honoring diversity and difference. It is honoring that just because someone is different than you doesn't mean that they don't have so much to offer. And our differences are what make us so amazing.
You're right. I couldn't agree more with that, because we should be able to show up as who we are authentically and bring what we have to the table and be loved and supported. And even if you don't agree with someone, there's a way to be respectful about it. I call it agree to disagree, and have that self-love and that self-respect to have others voice their opinions. I'd love to end with one more question, because I know that even though this is a very intense field that you're in, I know that in 20 years of practicing so far, there has to have been some sort of rewarding moment, or, seeing your clients transform before your eyes. Do you have one that sticks out to you where it was a rewarding moment for you to see in your client?
Well, it's hard to pick out one rewarding client. What I can say is that there's a lot of things that get in the way of people's lives, right? And when someone comes in and they have what I call the Swiss cheese effect, meaning that there are holes in their memories, and those holes are there and they're dark for protection's sake. And a lot of times those protections cause people to act in ways that are different than who they are at their core. Some people might say, that they've got multiple personalities. And so in thinking about that, the person who comes in who's been fractured and hurt, and actually because they've been so badly sexually traumatized that they have different alters, if you will, come in. And as a clinician, I might not know exactly who's going to be coming in or who might shift in a moment. And it does happen. Watching a client integrate to such a degree that it's not that those alters go away or the memories of those alters go away, but they are needed less, feels like exactly what I want all people to do, not because all people have alters, but that I want people to be able to take the Swiss cheeses of their lives, the dark holes, the places where their pain is hidden, and the ways that they've had to protect themselves, to find a way to protect the self and find safety and trust so that they can live lives that are worth living and find their lovability and move out of self-loathing into liberation.
I love that. Dr. Edie, thank you so much for being here today. It was, I definitely want my viewers to know, if they want to reach you, what is the best way to go about reaching you? If they want to come in, if they are locally to you, or even a phone call, how can they reach out to you?
So probably the best way to reach me is through my website, which is edienathan.com or sexualgrief.com. And I am not seeing people in person anymore because I travel so much. So it's kind of all Zoom at this point. But the other way is, you want to know more about my work, my book, It's Grief, The Dance of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss, is on Amazon. But if they mention that they, saw me on my website, you can do a contact. I will send you a free chapter, and then you can decide whether or not you want to even buy the book. And I have events going on all of the time that you can sign up for. Some are free, some are paid for, and we can all keep the conversation going.
I love that. Thank you so, so much for being here and just picking your brain. It was just such an honor to just give my listeners more tools for their toolboxes. Guys, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for spending your hour with me today. Don't forget to subscribe, share, reach out to Dr. Edie if you need help. Reach out to me if you guys need help. We are here for you. We're building community. I love you guys so much, and I will see you on the next episode. Be well.